Hey guys, welcome back to this week's episode of The Ownership Game. As I said last week, this is our last episode of the year and our last episode of season 1. We published our first episode back in January 16th, 2024, and we're ending the season with 45 episodes in the bag. Not too shabby, right? We did good. I thought to wrap up the season, I would break from our usual format and do something a little different. Now that I've been at this for almost a year, I wanted to take a moment to reflect on what I've learned from the process. We spend so much time rushing in our lives. And I think this is especially true if you are an entrepreneur, where it can easily feel like you are in a constant pattern of chasing the next sale, the next launch, the next milestone. I'm definitely guilty of that myself. One of the outcomes of this is that we don't always stop to reflect, especially when you finish a big hurdle or some sort of big push. We also don't stop to acknowledge what we've learned from the experience. How has it grown us or enriched our lives? We don't stop to acknowledge what we are grateful for, and more importantly, what can we be grateful for? And lastly, and probably most importantly, we don't stop to just acknowledge ourselves, acknowledge the effort, the sweat, blood, and tears, as they say. Acknowledge that you are in the game and that you are showing up every day. And I know a bunch of you just got triggered by me saying that and started spinning off the rails and judging yourselves. You started asking yourselves, well, am I really in the game? Am I really showing up? Do I really deserve to celebrate? I'm still struggling. What am I learning? Okay, I got it. Take a breath. Let me walk you through this. I understand the logic in thinking, or probably more specifically feeling, like you don't need to reflect or debrief when you don't feel like you're moving forward, when you don't feel like you're winning. But consider that that's when it's actually the most important. When things are not going how you want them to go, and you are committed to transforming them, then you have to get really interested in looking at two areas. And that's your competency and your commitment. Your competency is about your process, your knowledge and skills. Do you know how to do what you're trying to do? Commitment is about willpower, the mindset of doing what is necessary, and a vision powerful enough to inspire you to get up and try again every day. Without doing the work of stopping to reflect, you don't fully integrate the lessons that you're being learned. You don't develop those areas. You don't understand the insights that are being collected. And before you tell me you're not learning anything new, that's just BS. Failure and struggle is our biggest teachers in life. We learn just as much, if not more, from our failure than a win. Even if the lesson is, I don't want to go through that again, well, guess what? That's a very powerful lesson and a very powerful motivator. It requires you to put your ego aside. It requires you to be willing to get quiet and sit with your experience. And it requires you to have some very honest conversations with yourself. Going through this process is transformative every time without fail. Maybe not always in these big grand ways that feel monumental or epic, but in small building block ways that build a solid foundation and that take you one step closer to your goal. So for today's episode, I'm going to take some of my own coaching and reflect on the last year of podcasting and what I've learned along the way. I think the process will be valuable, as much for me as it will be for you. So let's get started.
Welcome to The Ownership Game with Gary Montalvo. What would it take to get into the driver's seat of your life and leave your mark? The Ownership Game starts now.
Okay, let's get into it. So, lesson number one. Lesson number one is just start. Just start. The idea for this podcast probably came to me around 2018 or so. For years, I kicked around the idea in my head, waiting for the right time, waiting for the courage, waiting for inspiration to hit, waiting, waiting, waiting. People kept asking me about it. People kept saying, "Hey, are you still doing this?" I'm like, "Yeah, yeah, soon. It's coming. It's coming." Does that sound familiar, perhaps? I was trying to have it all the details sorted out before I got started. I was trying to solve all the problems and the potential problems. Most of all, I was really terrified and avoiding. I kept asking myself, what's the point of another podcast? There are so many podcasts already out there. The space is already crowded. There are so many other more successful people out there doing it. I mean, I just went on and on trying to talk myself out of this idea. But the idea would not leave. And God, universe, whatever you believe in, just kept putting the idea in my ear over and over again and from different perspectives and different sources. Getting started, taking the first step was the hardest one. The moment I took the first step, the next one revealed itself. Producing a podcast is so much work, especially if you are doing it on your own without a team. There is a reason why most podcasts don't get past 10 episodes. But so many of the actual lessons that I learned along the way, I couldn't even see until I got started. For example, finding guests, vetting them, producing the episode, creating a workflow, those are all things that would have been difficult for me to figure out or even understand the challenge of until I had a few episodes under my belt. I was focused on the name, the format, the intro, the outro, but those were all one-time problems. The real challenge that I faced was how do I produce this podcast week after week while running my coaching business, the launches, the sales, the taking care of my clients, all while not having a large team yet. There is a way that I didn't really understand what I was getting into and what it was going to take to keep it going. So the best advice that I can give you is just to start. It doesn't have to be perfect. It doesn't have to be all sorted out. In fact, it's better if it's not. The more perfect, the more attached you become to that thing. The more you feel it has to go a certain way. It takes longer to pivot when you're attached to something. It takes longer to recover when you're attached to something. The truth is, whatever plan you drum up is going to change. It's going to change many times over, in fact. So trying to get it perfect, well, it's just a waste of time. And the time that you save from trying to get it perfect means you gain that time by starting sooner. And the sooner you get started, the sooner you can get the actual feedback that you need to inform the next steps. So, lesson one is just start. Okay, lesson two. Be open to being surprised along the way. There are a few times during the season that I was dreading an interview. For some reason or another, I wasn't looking forward to it. I remember my interview with Professor Ed Hess. Ed was one of the first people on the show that was outside of my social circle. He was someone I didn't really know. He also comes from academia. He's a professor. He has written something like 16 books. He's published hundreds of articles. This is the guy that you cite when you're writing a paper. This is the guy that you call when you want to do an interview and a story. I was so intimidated. I was doubting myself greatly. Am I smart enough to sit with this guy? Will I be able to pull out the story from him? Will I be able to connect with him? And more importantly, will he think that I'm an idiot and this is a total waste of his time? What transpired after that was a complete surprise. He was the loveliest, sweetest person. We connected on so many ideas and so many points of views. In the end, he said this was one of his favorite interviews ever and said the loveliest things about me and the work that I'm doing. The big, scary leader in academia said, "You get it. You are the real deal." My scariest moment became my favorite interview up until that point, and a moment that meant so much to me and started to give me so much courage to move forward. I had similar experiences time and time again while producing the podcast with other guests. And, for some reason, I just wasn't looking forward to it. Some for similar reasons, and others because I was judging. By putting my judgment aside, I was able to access my openness and curiosity. I was able to see past Ed's credentials to his humanity and vulnerability. So, be willing to be surprised along the way. And more than willing, look for those surprises. Don't just look for the lessons that reinforce your point of view, the point of view you already have. We do that so often. But I really am inviting you to look for the lessons that surprise you, the lessons that teach you something unexpectedly, something new, and the lessons that flip your whole world upside down. That interview, as I said before, was a big turning point for me because I started to have the courage to venture out and reach out to bigger and bigger guests. It was the first time that I had validation from someone outside of my social circle that I'm good at this. And that wouldn't have happened without me being willing to be wrong about the story that I had already in my head. So, lesson number 2 is be willing to be surprised along the way. Look for those surprises. They are going to be some of your biggest teachers. Number 3, it takes something to stick it out. In fact, it takes everything to stick it out. It's true that for the most of us, the first step is the hardest. But the second hardest step is the one you have to take right when you start doubting yourself. The point where it's not as fun. The point where you start to wonder if you're gonna make it, if it's worth all this effort. I call it the turbulence point. That point in the flight when you start to experience some rough air and the plane starts to shake and you get that pit in your stomach and you go, oh, shoot. Continuing to take steps through that takes everything. There's a reason why most businesses don't last over 3 years, or why most podcasts don't go past a season. Anything worth doing in life takes work. It requires sacrifice. But more than that, it requires a willingness to ride out the turbulence. Staying motivated when your podcast numbers are not increasing, when it's the same people listening in week after week, takes something. Staying connected to your love and passion for it when the podcast is not making you any money takes something. Staying connected to your vision and continuing to believe in your vision takes everything. When all the evidence tells you the cards are insurmountably stacked against you, takes everything. But what I've learned is the worst thing you can do is pause. The moment you stop, fear and doubt take over and atrophy starts to set in. And I don't mean an active pause, an intentional break or a rest. I mean the kind of stop that has you unsure if you're ever gonna get moving again. Keep moving. Keep taking a step. Don't worry about the end goal. Worry about today's goal. Worry about tomorrow's goal. That's what's in front of you right now. And this brings me to my next lesson, and probably the hardest one for me. Lesson number 4, acknowledge every step of the way. If I can do anything over again, I would acknowledge and celebrate myself more. I was often more focused on the challenges of publishing and keeping up with a weekly podcast than I was on the moments of joy that it brought me. I was more focused on where the podcast was not, that I missed a great deal of milestones and celebrations along the way. I didn't celebrate hitting 25 episodes, or when episode 39, Denied Identity with Michelle Waldman, hit 18,000 views on YouTube. I didn't celebrate my 5-star rating on Apple Podcasts or Spotify, or the many meaningful messages I received sharing how much they love the podcast or how a particular story really touched them, made a difference for them. I just worked on. I appreciated those wins. The feedback meant something to me, but in my mind, it somehow wasn't a big enough thing to be celebrated. They were not acknowledged as big accomplishments. They were not seen as evidence that the effort I was putting in every day was taking me a step closer to my goal. If I'm being really honest, I spent a lot of time focused on where the podcast was not, how the podcast was not monetizing, how the podcast was not bringing me in clients, how producing the podcast was costing me money every week, how the download numbers were just not really growing. As a result, I think I often didn't enjoy the process. I always enjoyed the interviews and the conversations, but I wasn't connected with the love I have for doing this. And I really love doing this. And I think I'm good at it. I think I have a knack for it. And I think with more resources and time, I can really make something out of this. But instead of each step being a labor of love, well, it was just labor. I robbed myself of enjoying the journey. I robbed myself of enjoying the ride. I robbed myself of the celebrations along the way. And I think I robbed myself of the gift of sharing the podcast more, sharing my journey more. And in turn, I probably robbed you of seeing more behind the curtain and being part of the process with me, of seeing someone you know taking steps towards their dreams, of rooting for me, and of being inspired to do your version of whatever it is that you're meant to be doing. Luckily, I can recognize this now. Looking back, I can honestly say that I'm really proud of myself. I'm proud of finally starting on a dream of mine. I'm proud of sticking with it when there were plenty of times that I wanted to quit. I'm proud of putting myself out there when it was so scary. I'm proud of the times that I reached out to people that scared me and asked them to be on the show. I'm proud of making something special that I think means something to people, even if it's just a few people right now. I put a lot of thought and effort into this. I put a lot of heart into it. And most of all, I'm proud of choosing to live in my passion and purpose. I think some days that's probably the hardest part of all, to show up, to keep shining my light despite whatever crazy mess is going on in my head at the time. I want to thank you for coming on this journey with me. I can't tell you how much it means to me. Thank you for the reviews, the subscribers, the likes. Most of all, thank you for the shares. Please know that each one of them made a huge difference for me. Each one of them inspired me to keep going and to keep getting better. Thank you for believing in me. Thank you for the gift of your time and your attention. And please know that I'm so excited to continue this journey with you. So I will be back in February with some brand new shows. I've already started working on next year's season and it's going to be fire. Please remember that the Ownership Game has a mailing list. So if you want to stay up to date on the podcast news as well as get the podcast delivered to your inbox each week, you can sign up by visiting theownershipgame.com. On that page, you can also send me messages to recommend speakers or future topics that you'd like me to tackle. Don't be shy. I would love, love, love to hear your thoughts and your suggestions. Until then, have the most amazing holiday season. Whatever you celebrate during this time of the year, I hope that it is joyful and filled with love. And most of all, my prayers for you are that you have the courage to follow your heart and live a life of ownership. Until next time, my friends.
Thanks for listening to this episode of The Ownership Game with your host, Gary Montalvo. Make sure to like and comment on your favorite podcast platform, as well as subscribe so that you never miss an episode.